On that November morning in 2023, Isabella Hoffman sat in her elegant apartment in downtown Shanghai and looked out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the life of a metropolis that never slept pulsated. Inside, there was a silence interrupted only by the soft clicking of her fingernails on her smartphone. Numbers flickered on the screen that would seem unreal to most people. 100 million yuan in a single live-stream session. Her face showed no particular emotion, neither triumph nor surprise. It was as if she had expected exactly this. However, this woman's story does not begin in Shanghai, but 40 years earlier, in a completely different world. Hamburg, early 1980s, a wealthy merchant family that had been in the textile trade for generations. The father, Friedrich Hoffmann, ran a medium-sized company with considerable success. The mother, Margaret, came from an old Hamburg family whose name still carried weight in certain circles. She was a woman who valued poise, appearance, and the right demeanor in society. Isabella grew up as an only child in this environment. Her childhood was marked by material abundance, but also by clear expectations. She learned early on that beauty was a currency, perhaps the most valuable one of all. At the age of 5, her mother took her to exclusive events and dressed her in outfits that cost more than the average employee's monthly salary. Isabella learned how to move, how to speak, how to attract attention, and at the same time maintain a certain distance. She spent her school days at a private high school where she grew up among children from similarly privileged backgrounds. Her classmates envied her flawless appearance, her long dark hair, her large eyes, her delicate facial features. But Isabella was more than just a pretty face. She possessed a sharp intelligence, a talent for languages, and a keen sense of social dynamics. She instinctively understood who had power in a room, who had influence, who could be useful. After graduating from high school, she studied art history and business administration in Munich. It was an unusual combination, but that was precisely what made her interesting. She moved with ease between different worlds, the intellectual milieu of the art scene and the pragmatic world of business. Her fellow students later described her as charming, but difficult to read. She was always friendly, always perfectly dressed, always wearing a smile that never reached her eyes. At the age of 26, in the fall of 2009, Isabella met the man who would fundamentally change her life. Or rather, whose life she would fundamentally change. His name was Matthias Berger, and he was 42 years old at the time. Matthias had built up a considerable fortune through a chain of real estate developments in southern Germany. He was well known in Munich society, a man with charisma and success, but also with a certain loneliness that he hid behind his busy facade. The two met at an exhibition opening at the Pinakothek der Moderne. Isabella was standing in front of a work by Gerhard Richter, seemingly lost in thought. Matthias, who was an art collector himself, approached her. What followed was a conversation about painting, about light and color, about the meaning of art in an increasingly digital world. He was fascinated. Here was a young woman who was not only exceptionally beautiful, but who could also talk intelligently about things that were important to him. Within a few weeks, an intense relationship developed. Matthias was intoxicated. Isabella had a way about her that made him feel like he was the most interesting man in the world. She listened when he talked about his projects. She asked intelligent questions. She showed interest in his dreams, his plans, his concerns. What he didn't notice, or didn't want to notice, was the way she gathered certain information, how she casually asked about financial details, how she inquired about his business partners, his investments, the structure of his assets. After 3 months, Matthias proposed to her. It happened during dinner in his penthouse overlooking the Munich skyline. He had prepared everything perfectly. Champagne, candles, a ring that cost more than a small car. Isabella hesitated for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but to show the right degree of surprise and emotion. Then she nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and whispered a yes that sounded as perfect as if she had rehearsed it. The wedding took place in the spring of 2010, in a castle south of Munich. 300 guests, an event that was extensively documented in the local society magazines. Isabella wore a dress that had been custom-made by a French designer. The cost of the ceremony amounted to a 6-figure sum. Matthias was happy, his business partners were impressed, and the guests whispered about the extraordinary beauty of the bride. Life as the wife of a wealthy real estate developer offered Isabella everything she was used to and more. A spacious estate on Lake Starnberg, trips to Paris, London, New York, an unlimited budget for clothes, jewelry, art. Matthias denied her nothing. He loved to see her happy, or what he thought was happiness. What he didn't see was the way Isabella began to interfere in his business affairs in the first few months of their marriage. It started subtly. She showed interest in his real estate projects. She wanted to understand how the financing worked, how the contracts were structured. Matthias, flattered by her interest, willingly explained the details to her. Isabella was a quick learner. Soon she was proposing projects herself. She had a friend in Berlin whose family owned land. She knew an architect who developed innovative concepts. Matthias, convinced of her business acumen, began to implement her suggestions. In the summer of 2011, Isabella pushed for a larger investment. A development project in Berlin Mitte, a former industrial site that was to be converted into luxury apartments. The consultants assured him that the returns would be exceptional. Matthias hesitated. The project would tie up a significant portion of his liquid capital. But Isabella was convinced. She talked him into it with a mixture of rational arguments and emotional appeals. Finally, he gave in. What Matthias didn't know was that Isabella had also established contact with one of the developers involved. A man named Stefan Brandt, in his early 50s, married himself but susceptible to the attention of a beautiful younger woman. The two met for business meetings that took on an increasingly personal character. Stefan was fascinated by Isabella. She seemed to understand him, his ambitions, his frustration with a marriage that had long since become routine. The investment in Berlin initially developed promisingly. The building permits were granted and work began. But then, in the spring of 2012, problems began to arise. Delays in construction, cost overruns, conflicts with the building authorities. Matthias became nervous. He flew to Berlin several times a week, trying to get the situation under control. Isabella rarely accompanied him. She said she had her own projects to look after in Munich. In reality, she used her husband's absence to deepen her relationship with Stefan. The two became more careless. There were dinners in discreet restaurants, weekends in secluded hotels. Stefan, long since emotionally dependent, began to confide in Isabella about business decisions that were actually confidential. She learned about financing problems, liquidity bottlenecks, and internal conflicts among the partners. In the fall of 2012, the crisis reached its peak. The Berlin project was on the verge of collapse. Matthias had already injected considerable sums of money to keep the work going. Now he was faced with a decision. Either invest millions more to save the project or accept the loss and withdraw. Isabella advised him to continue. She presented figures, forecasts, arguments. Matthias, exhausted and desperate, trusted her. He continued to drain his assets. He took out loans, mortgaged real estate, and liquidated other investments, all to save the Berlin project. But it was in vain. In the spring of 2013, the project had to be wound up. The losses were catastrophic. Matthias had lost almost 30 million euros in less than 2 years. His once flourishing company was on the brink of bankruptcy. During this time, as Matthias struggled with the ruins of his business, Isabella changed. She became more distant, more cold. The evenings they had once spent together became rarer. She was often away, attending meetings she vaguely described as business. Matthias, too preoccupied with his own problems, only noticed late how far she had already distanced herself from him. In the summer of 2013, Matthias found out by chance that Isabella was having an affair with Stefan Brandt. A mutual acquaintance had seen the two of them in Hamburg in a situation that left no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. Matthias confronted Isabella. She didn't deny anything. Instead, she coolly told him that the marriage was over for her. She wanted a divorce. Matthias was stunned. Within a few years, he had lost not only his fortune, but also his wife. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 2014. Isabella received a substantial settlement, even though Matthias's financial situation was already dire. His lawyers advised him to appeal, but he no longer had the strength to fight. He just wanted it to be over. Isabella left Munich and moved to Hamburg. At that point, she was no longer interested in what had become of Stefan Brandt. He had served his purpose. Matthias Berger had to file for personal bankruptcy in the fall of 2014. The man who had once been one of the most successful real estate developers in southern Germany now lived in a two-room apartment and tried to make ends meet with consulting jobs. Friends described him as broken, a shadow of his former self. He hardly ever spoke about Isabella, but when he did, there was a mixture of bitterness and something else in his voice. A kind of incredulous amazement at how completely he had been deceived. Isabella, on the other hand, seemed unaffected by the events. In Hamburg, she rented an elegant apartment in Hafen City. She began to establish herself as a consultant for luxury brands, using her contacts from her time in Munich, her charisma, and her flair for trends. She invested the money from the divorce wisely, diversifying without taking any major risks. She lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. It seemed as if she had learned from the experiences of the past few years. But anyone who observed Isabella Hoffmann during this time could have noticed that she was already on the lookout for new opportunities. She attended events, vernissages, charity events, always perfectly dressed, always with the right amount of interest and distance. She was searching, not for love, not for affection, but for the next opportunity. That opportunity would arise in the fall of 2015 at an economic congress in Frankfurt. There she met a man who was in many ways the opposite of Matthias Berger. His name was Thomas Schumacher. He was 58 years old, and his fortune was estimated at over 200 million euros. He had not made his money in real estate, but through a series of successful investments in technology companies. He was known for his sharp mind, his caution, his ability to see through people. But Thomas Schumacher also had a weakness. He was lonely. His marriage had failed years ago. His children lived abroad, and the women he met were obviously only interested in his money. When he met Isabella, he was fascinated by her reserve. She didn't seem needy or calculating. She seemed to see him as a person, not a bank account. It was a perfect deception, and Thomas Schumacher did not see through it. Thomas Schumacher was not a man who was easily impressed. In his more than 30-year career, he had seen through countless business partners, exposed fraudsters, and avoided risky deals that would have ruined others. His ability to read people was considered legendary in the circles in which he moved. But Isabella Hoffmann was different. She played a game so subtle that even an experienced man like Thomas didn't recognize the traps until it was too late. Their first encounter at the Frankfurt Business Congress in the fall of 2015 seemed like a coincidence. Isabella stood in a group of entrepreneurs, listening more than she spoke. When Thomas approached the group, she recognized him immediately. She had prepared herself, knew about his investments, his failed marriage, his adult children who lived in Canada and Australia. But she didn't show any of that. When he spoke to her, She seemed politely surprised, almost a little reserved. The conversation initially revolved around general topics: economic developments, digital transformation, art markets. Isabella expressed herself intelligently, but not arrogantly. She asked questions that showed she was listening and understanding. Thomas, who was used to women showering him with admiration or obviously coveting his money, found this reserve refreshing. At the end of the evening, they exchanged business cards. He invited her to dinner. She hesitated for a moment, then agreed. Over the following months, a relationship developed that was different from Thomas's previous experiences. Isabella did not impose herself on him. She had her own life, her own career as a consultant. When they met, they had intense, profound conversations. They talked about philosophy, about the transience of success, about the loneliness that comes with wealth. Thomas felt understood. For the first time in years, he felt he had found someone who appreciated him as a person, not just as a wealthy investor. In the summer of 2016, Thomas made Isabella a proposal. Not marriage, he had already been through that, but a life partnership, a future together. He offered to move to Hamburg, where she lived, and build a life together there. Isabella seemed touched. She said she needed time to think about it. This apparent uncertainty only made her more authentic in his eyes. When she finally agreed, a phase began that Thomas would later describe as the happiest years of his life. They rented a penthouse together on the Elbe with a view of the harbour. Isabella took care of the interior design, transforming the rooms into an elegant home. She organized small dinner parties where she impressed Thomas's business partners with her charm and intelligence. She accompanied him to events, beaming at his side without ever wanting to be the center of attention. But while Thomas believed he had finally found personal happiness, Isabella was already beginning to implement her plans. It happened so slowly that he didn't notice. She showed interest in his investments and asked intelligent questions about his technology holdings. Thomas, proud of his knowledge, willingly explained the structures to her. He told her about the startups he had invested in and the promising developments in artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Isabella listened, took notes and asked for details. She began doing her own research, reading trade journals, attending conferences. Soon, she was able to discuss his investments with Thomas on an equal footing. He was impressed by her quick grasp of the subject matter. What he didn't know was that Isabella had already begun to establish contacts in the industry. She met with founders, other investors, and consultants, always under the pretext of expanding her knowledge so she could better support Thomas. In the spring of 2017, Isabella approached Thomas with a proposal. A young startup from Berlin specializing in blockchain technology. The founder, a brilliant computer scientist named Daniel Weiss, was looking for investors for a new round of financing. Isabella had met him at a tech conference and was convinced by his concept. The technology, she explained to Thomas, had the potential to revolutionize entire industries. Thomas was skeptical at first. He was familiar with blockchain, but had doubts about the maturity of the technology. But Isabella was persistent. She organized a meeting with Daniel Weiss, presented detailed analyses, and showed market forecasts. Finally, Thomas agreed to invest a substantial sum, 15 million euros, a considerable amount, but quite affordable for someone with his wealth. What Thomas didn't know was that Isabella had long since established a relationship with Daniel Weiss that went beyond business. The two met regularly, initially under the pretext of project discussions. Daniel, in his mid-30s, divorced and completely absorbed in his work, was susceptible to Isabella's attention. She understood his vision, his frustration with the slow pace of development, his fears of failure. She became his confidant, his advisor, and eventually his lover. The investment in Daniel's startup initially developed promisingly. The company grew, new partners joined, and the technology was further developed. Thomas was satisfied. He praised Isabella for her good instincts, but in the background, the next phase of Isabella's plan was already taking shape. She urged Daniel to expand more aggressively. More staff, larger offices, expensive marketing campaigns. The startup needed more capital. In the fall of 2017, Isabella suggested to Thomas that they conduct another round of financing. This time, it was 25 million euros. Thomas hesitated. He thought the company's valuation was too high and the business figures weren't convincing enough. But Isabella presented him with figures that Daniel had given her, forecasts that sounded impressive. She talked about strategic partnerships that were about to be finalized and major customers who were showing interest. Thomas, trusting Isabella's judgment and the information she claimed to have firsthand, agreed. What he didn't know was that the figures had been embellished. The partnerships existed only on paper, and the major customers had never been more than vague expressions of interest. Daniel, pressured by Isabella and driven by his own desperation, had glossed over the reality. The startup was already in serious trouble, but Thomas didn't find out until months later. In the spring of 2018, the facade collapsed. The startup was no longer able to meet its payment obligations. Employees were not being paid. Suppliers were demanding their money. Daniel Weiss desperately tried to save the situation, but it was too late. In June 2018, the company had to file for bankruptcy. Thomas Schumacher had lost 40 million euros in less than 2 years. The news hit him hard, not only because of the financial loss, although that was considerable, but because, for the first time, he doubted his own judgment. He had relied on Isabella, on her analyses, on her assessments. How could he have been so wrong? Isabella reacted with apparent horror. She said she had also been deceived. Daniel had lied to her, falsified figures. She was just as much a victim as Thomas. But Thomas began to have his suspicions. Little things he hadn't noticed before suddenly added up. The frequent meetings with Daniel, the way she had always suggested new investments, her aloofness in recent months. Thomas Schumacher was not the kind of man to ignore his doubts. Decades of experience in the business world had taught him to listen to his gut feeling. On a rainy July evening in 2018, he sat in his study and began to systematically reconstruct the events of the last 2 years. He searched through emails, contracts, and meeting minutes. What he found made his blood run cold. The connection between Isabella and Daniel Weiss went far beyond business contacts. There were hotel bills in her name, flight bookings to the same destinations, credit card statements for dinners together in discreet restaurants. Thomas confronted a mutual acquaintance who finally admitted to having seen the two together on several occasions, in situations that left no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. When Thomas confronted Isabella the next evening, she initially reacted with feigned indignation. How could he accuse her of such a thing? But Thomas had proof. He laid the documents on the table, one after the other. Isabella was silent. Her mask began to crumble. Then, after a long silence, she said something Thomas would never forget. "You got what you wanted. A beautiful woman by your side who made you look good in front of your business partners. Don't expect love as well." The coldness in her voice was more frightening than the words themselves. Thomas realized at that moment that he had never really known who this woman was. The Isabella he had fallen in love with had never existed. She had been a construct, a carefully crafted illusion. Isabella left the penthouse that same night. She took only the bare essentials with her, her designer clothes, her jewelry, her documents. Within a week, she had disappeared from Hamburg. Thomas tried to reach her, not out of love, but to get answers, to understand. But Isabella was nowhere to be found. Her phone number had been disconnected, her email address no longer existed. It was as if she had never existed. In the weeks that followed, Thomas learned more about Isabella's past. A lawyer friend of his discreetly did some research and found out that there had been another man before him, Matthias Berger from Munich. He too had lost a fortune, and he too had been financially ruined after separating from Isabella. The pattern was frighteningly similar. Thomas contacted Matthias. The conversation between the two men was brief but revealing. Matthias described his experiences, the manipulation, the financial losses, the emotional destruction. "She's like a phantom," Matthias said. "She comes, she takes what she wants, and then she disappears, and you're left with the wreckage of your life." Thomas tried to take legal action, but his lawyer explained the difficult reality to him. Isabella had not formally done anything illegal. The investment decisions had been his own. She had advised him, yes, but the final decision had always been his. There was no basis for a lawsuit that would have any chance of success. Daniel Weiss also tried to reach Thomas, but the young entrepreneur had fallen into a deep depression after his startup went bankrupt. Friends reported that he blamed himself and hardly left the house anymore. He felt responsible for the loss of Thomas's money, but also betrayed by Isabella, who had promised him love and then disappeared without a word. For Thomas, the loss of 40 million euros did not mean the end of his financial existence. He was still wealthy and able to maintain his lifestyle, but something inside him had broken. His confidence in his own judgment, his ability to see through people, which he had considered his greatest strength his entire life. A woman had completely deceived him, and he hadn't noticed until it was too late. The name Isabella Hoffmann did not appear in the media. The story remained hidden, known only in small circles of the Hamburg and Munich business world. There were rumors, whispered warnings at social events. "Beware of the beautiful woman with the intelligent eyes," they said. But there was no concrete evidence, no public accusation. Isabella herself had disappeared without a trace. There were reports that she had gone to Asia, to Shanghai. Others spoke of London or New York. No one knew for sure. What no one suspected was that Isabella had already begun her next transformation. The time of men, marriages, and risky investments was over. She had accumulated enough capital to strike out on a new path, a path where she was no longer dependent on anyone. Shanghai in the fall of 2018, a city that never stands still, where the past doesn't matter and only the present counts. This is where Isabella Hoffmann reappeared, but not under that name. She now called herself Elena Weber, an art consultant and fashion expert from Switzerland. The story she told was carefully constructed: a successful career in Europe, the desire for new challenges in the emerging Asian market. Shanghai offered her exactly what she needed: anonymity in the crowd, a society more interested in success than origin, and a booming market for luxury goods. The Chinese upper class was hungry for European elegance, insider knowledge about designer brands, someone to help them navigate the world of Western luxury. Isabella rented an elegant apartment in the French concession district, a neighborhood that combined colonial architecture with modern luxury. She set up an office, discreet but tasteful. Her strategy had changed fundamentally. No more men, no more emotional entanglements, no more risky investments in someone else's name. This time, she would build her own empire, controlled, calculated, independent. She began to make contacts in Shanghai society: vernissages, fashion shows, private dinner parties. Her perfect appearance, her language skills, and her knowledge of European art markets opened doors for her. Wealthy Chinese businesswomen sought her advice, wanting to learn how to dress in Paris or Milan, which artists to collect, how to bid at international auctions. Isabella quickly recognized a gap in the market. Wealthy Chinese women were willing to spend exorbitant sums on luxury goods, but they often had no direct access to limited editions, to pieces that were shown on the catwalks but never available in regular stores. Isabella positioned herself as an intermediary. She used her old contacts in Europe, reactivating relationships with designers and boutique owners that she had built up during her time with Matthias and Thomas. In the spring of 2019, she officially founded her own company, Maison Weber, specializing in exclusive fashion consulting and personal shopping for wealthy clients. The first few months were tough, but Isabella had learned to be patient. She invested in her network and organized small, exclusive events where she presented European designer fashion. Slowly, her customer base grew. The breakthrough came in the summer of 2019 when she put together a complete wardrobe for Paris Fashion Week for a prominent businesswoman from Shanghai. The woman was thrilled, posted photos on social media, and tagged Isabella's company. Suddenly, requests came flooding in. Isabella hired staff, assistants to help her cope with the growing demand. But Isabella knew that personal shopping alone would not be enough. She needed something bigger, something that would set her apart from the market. In 2020, during the pandemic, when the world came to a standstill, she recognized her next opportunity: live streaming. Already a billion-dollar business in China, but still dominated by young influencers selling mass-market products. No one had yet sold luxury fashion via live streaming, not with the sophistication and cultural appeal Isabella had in mind. She spent months preparing. She studied the most successful live streamers, analyzing their techniques, their rhetoric, their camera work. But she knew she had to be different. She wouldn't shout or act with exaggerated enthusiasm like the others. Instead, she would combine education and luxury, art and commerce, culture and consumption. In May 2021, Isabella launched her first live stream on the Xiaohongshu platform, the Chinese equivalent of Instagram. She sat in her elegantly furnished studio, wearing a simple black dress with a reproduction of Botticelli's Primavera hanging in the background. She didn't start with a product, but with a story about the Renaissance, about the symbolism of flowers in art, about the timeless elegance that has endured through the centuries. Then, almost as an afterthought, she presented an eyeshadow palette whose colors were inspired by the tones of the painting. She talked about the pigments, about the harmony of the colors, quoting Baudelaire in French. The audience was fascinated. Within minutes, the palette was sold out. Isabella smiled, a cool, controlled smile, and moved on to the next product. The live stream went viral. 600 million views. Sales figures exploded. Isabella had tapped into a new market. Luxury for the educated elite, packaged in cultural references, poetry, art. She became a sensation. The media called her the culture queen of live streaming. In the months that followed, her success grew exponentially. Every live stream broke new records. In October 2023, the total value of products placed in shopping carts during a single session reached 100 million yuan. Isabella had made it. She was rich, famous, independent. But in Europe, there were people who saw her rise with different eyes. Matthias Berger, now back on his feet but never really recovered from his financial collapse, saw a video of Isabella one day. He recognized her immediately, despite the new name, despite the years. The anger that rose within him was overwhelming. Thomas Schumacher also learned of her success. A business partner living in Shanghai sent him a link. Thomas sat in his Hamburg office and watched as the woman who had ruined him earned millions. The irony was bitter. Matthias Berger sat in his small apartment in Munich and stared at his laptop screen. The video played on a continuous loop. Isabella, or Elena as she now called herself, sold luxury goods worth millions with a charming smile. The comments below the video praised her as a genius, a role model, an inspiration. He picked up the phone and called Thomas Schumacher. The two men had kept in sporadic contact since their first conversation years ago, connected by their shared fate of having been deceived by the same woman. "Have you seen it?" Matthias asked without greeting him. Thomas's voice sounded tired. "Yes, I've seen it." They discussed what they could do. A complaint. But for what? They had invested in the projects themselves back then, signed the contracts. Public accusations. But without evidence, they would just look like bitter ex-partners. Isabella had moved skillfully, always on the edge of legality, never clearly criminal. Thomas suggested contacting journalists. An investigation into Isabella's past could cause her perfect facade to crumble. Matthias hesitated. What would that change? She was now in China, beyond the reach of German law, and even if her story became public, would the Chinese market care? Meanwhile, Isabella continued to live in her immaculate world in Shanghai. But even she knew that the past had a way of catching up with you. During one of her live streams, a comment suddenly appeared in German. "Ask her about Munich. Ask her about the men she ruined." The comment quickly disappeared, deleted by her moderators. But Isabella had seen it. That evening, she sat alone in her apartment, gazing out over the glittering Shanghai skyline. For the first time in years, she felt something like unease. Not remorse. That concept was foreign to her. But the realization that her carefully constructed new identity might not be as impenetrable as she had believed. She opened her laptop and searched for her own name. Isabella Hoffman. The results were sparse, but they were there. A forum discussing failed investments. Hints, rumors, no concrete evidence, but enough to raise questions. Isabella closed the laptop. She had no intention of going into hiding. Not this time. She had built too much, achieved too much. If the past wanted to catch up with her, she would be ready, with lawyers, with a PR strategy, with the power that money and influence offered. In December 2023, the story reached its turning point. A German investigative journalist named Michael Kraus had been researching for months. He had spoken to Matthias Berger, to Thomas Schumacher, to former business partners, to people who had known Isabella at different stages of her life. He had collected documents, created timelines, recognized patterns. His article appeared in a renowned business magazine. The title, "The Woman with Many Faces: How a German Woman Made Millions in China and Left a Trail of Destruction in Europe." The text was carefully worded and legally sound. No direct accusations, just facts, timelines, statements from those affected. The reaction was overwhelming. Within hours, the article had been shared thousands of times. German media picked up the story. There were discussions on talk shows and comments on social networks. Some defended Isabella, talking about successful businesswomen who always had to contend with envy. Others demanded consequences, talking about moral responsibility. In Shanghai, the story reached Isabella via her German contacts. She read the article in her office, her face expressionless. Then she called her lawyers. Within 2 days, she published a statement on her Chinese social media channels. It was written in Chinese, eloquent and strategic. She spoke of failed relationships, of business risks that had not paid off, of men who, years later, could not bear her success. She presented herself as a victim of envy and misogyny. The Chinese public, for whom the details of the German business world were far removed anyway, mostly believed her. But the damage was done. Some of her European business partners withdrew. Brands that had worked with her cautiously distanced themselves. Isabella sensed that her position in Shanghai was still strong, but no longer unassailable. On a cold January night in 2024, she sat at the window of her apartment again. Outside, the city sparkled with 1,000 lights. She thought of Matthias, of Thomas, of the other men she had used in her life. Did she regret anything? No. She had survived, had reinvented herself again and again, had created success from ruins. The question now facing her was a different one. How long could she keep going? How many identities could a person have before the past became too heavy to shake off? Isabella stood up and poured herself a glass of wine. She would not give up, not now. Maybe one day she would leave Shanghai, find a new city, take on a new identity. Maybe she would have to stop at some point, but not today. In Munich and Hamburg, two men sat in front of their screens and read Isabella's statement. Matthias Berger just shook his head. Thomas Schumacher closed his eyes. They both knew they would never get justice. Isabella had escaped. Once again. The story didn't end with a bang, but with a quiet fade. Isabella stayed in Shanghai. Her live streams continued, though no longer with the same resonance. The men she had ruined continued to live with the consequences. And somewhere in the world, the next opportunity was perhaps already waiting.